They starved, bled, and burned, and we never stopped advancing. The Japanese bunkers ahead of us erupted in orange flame as our flamethrowers did their terrible work, and through the acrid smoke, I could see enemy soldiers stumbling out, their uniforms ablaze. Some fell immediately under our rifle fire. Others kept running until the jungle swallowed them whole. But there would be no escape from this green hell we had created together, American and Japanese alike, in the fetid swamps of Papua New Guinea. My name is Captain Robert Hayes, and I led Company B of the 2nd Battalion, 126th Infantry Regiment, through some of the most brutal fighting of World War II. What I'm about to tell you happened between November 1942 and January 1943, in a pestilent corner of the world that most Americans had never heard of, until our boys started dying there by the thousands. The date was November 19, 1942, when we first laid eyes on the Buna-Gona beachhead. I was 26 years old, a school teacher from Iowa, who'd been transformed by 18 months of training into something I barely recognized. Standing there in the oppressive humidity, sweat already soaking through my fatigues despite the early morning hour, I stared across the final stretch of jungle that separated us from the Japanese fortifications, whispered Lieutenant Morrison, my platoon leader, as he studied the terrain through his binoculars. Look at those positions. I took the field glasses from him and felt my stomach drop. The Japanese had spent months turning Buna and Gona into fortress complexes that seemed to grow out of the jungle itself. Concrete bunkers were camouflaged with palm fronds and dirt. Machine gun nests were dug so deep into coconut logs that they were practically invisible. Interconnected trenches snaked between defensive positions like a spider's web. And everywhere, the glint of steel, rifle barrels, mortar tubes, the deadly snouts of anti-aircraft guns turned horizontal to cut down advancing infantry. Estimate 4,000 enemy troops between both positions, I said quietly, handing back the binoculars. Maybe more. What I didn't tell Morrison was that our intelligence report suggested the Japanese 144th Infantry Regiment and elements of the South Seas Detachment weren't just well fortified, they were desperate. Cut off from supply lines and reinforcements, they had been ordered to hold their positions to the death. Emperor Hirohito himself had declared that Buna and Gona must never fall. The Japanese commander, Colonel Yokoyama, had spent the previous 4 months preparing for exactly this moment. His men had constructed what would later be called some of the most formidable defensive positions in the Pacific Theater. Every approach was covered by interlocking fields of fire. Every bunker was connected to its neighbors by communication trenches. Every palm tree potentially concealed a sniper. But we had advantages too, though they came at a cost that would haunt me for decades. By November 1942, the Japanese garrison was already weakening from disease and starvation. Their supply runs from Rabaul had been cut to a trickle by Allied air power and naval interdiction. Malaria, dengue fever, dysentery, and a dozen other tropical diseases were eating them alive just as surely as they were Yatingas. The difference was that we could evacuate our sick and wounded. They could not. I remember the morning of November 19th with perfect clarity because it was the last morning any of us felt truly human. We'd been fighting our way through the Owen Stanley Mountains for 2 months, pushing the Japanese back step by bloody step along the Kokoda Track. Now, finally, we were in position to assault their final strongholds on the northern coast. Company commanders report to Battalion CP. Came the call over the radio. I made my way through the jungle to where Lieutenant Colonel Herbert Smith had set up our command post in a grove of sago palms. The humidity was so thick, I felt like I was breathing soup. My uniform stuck to my skin like a second layer of hide, and the constant buzz of insects created a maddening soundtrack that never, ever stopped. Gentlemen, Smith began without preamble, we attack at 0700 hours tomorrow. The 2nd Battalion will assault Buna Village while the 3rd Battalion moves on the government station. Australian forces will simultaneously attack Gona from the west. He pointed to a hand-drawn map spread across an ammunition crate. Intelligence estimates 1,200 enemy troops at Buna alone, plus an unknown number of civilians who may be armed. They've had 4 months to dig in, and every indication suggests they'll fight to the last man. Captain Williams from Alpha Company raised his hand. Sir, what about armor support? Artillery. Smith's face darkened. Minimal. The terrain won't support tanks, and our artillery is limited to what we can manhandle through the jungle. We'll have some mortar support and whatever the Air Corps can give us, but this is going to be primarily an infantry fight." The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken understanding. We were about to assault prepared positions with nothing but rifles, machine guns, and raw courage. In military terms, attacking fortified positions without armor or heavy artillery support is close to suicide. The textbook ratio for success is 3 attackers to every defender. We would be attacking nearly even odds. "One more thing," Smith added. "Prisoners have told us the Japanese are calling this place the Green Hell. By tomorrow night, I intend for them to understand why." I spent that evening walking among my men, checking equipment and trying to gauge morale. Company B consisted of 180 soldiers, though disease had already reduced our effective strength to about 140. Most were kids from the Midwest, farm boys from Iowa, Illinois, and Wisconsin who'd never seen anything more exotic than Chicago before the war. Private Johnson, a 19-year-old from Cedar Rapids, was cleaning his M1 Garand for what must have been the 10th time that day. His hand shook slightly as he worked. "You okay, son?" I asked. He looked up with eyes that seemed too old for his face. "Just nervous, Captain." "This is going to be bad, isn't it?" I crouched down beside him. "It's going to be hard," I said honestly. "But remember your training. Stay low, move fast, and keep your weapon clean. The Japanese are tough fighters, but they're cut off and starving. We have the momentum." What he didn't tell him was that our intelligence reports painted a grimmer picture. The Japanese defenders were indeed starving and diseased, but that only made them more dangerous. Men with nothing to lose fight like cornered animals. The attack began at dawn on November 20th, 1942. I still remember the smell, cordite, rotting vegetation, and the sweet, sick odor of death that already permeated the jungle. The sound was even worse. The chatter of machine guns, the whistle of mortar rounds, and underneath it all, the screaming. We advanced in 3 waves across a stretch of kunai grass that provided almost no cover. The Japanese had cleared fields of fire extending 200 yards in every direction from their bunkers. It was like crossing a shooting gallery while the targets shot back. "Move! Move! Move!" I shouted, leading the first platoon forward in short rushes. We would dash 20 yards, hit the dirt, then dash again while the next group prepared to leapfrog past us. The first Japanese machine gun opened up when we were still 150 yards out. I heard the distinctive ripping sound of a Nambu Type 96 and saw geysers of dirt erupting around Private Martinez as he dove for cover behind a fallen palm trunk. "Covering fire," I yelled. "Second squad, suppress that position." Our bars, Browning automatic rifles, opened up with their slower, heavier rhythm. But the Japanese gunner was well protected, and our bullets sparked harmlessly off his concrete bunker. That's when Sergeant Tom O'Brien proved why he was the best NCO in the company. Without waiting for orders, he grabbed a 5-man team and began working around the bunker's left flank. I watched through my binoculars as they crawled through a drainage ditch, using every scrap of cover. The machine gun kept hammering away at our main line. Private Collins took a round through the shoulder and rolled behind a termite mound, screaming for a medic. Private Thompson wasn't so lucky. A burst caught him in the chest. Ash tried to advance, and he dropped without a sound. Then O'Brien's team was in position. I saw him stand up about 30 yards from the bunker's side, arm cocked back. The grenade seemed to hang in the air forever before disappearing into the firing slit. The explosion was muffled but decisive. The machine gun fell silent. "First platoon, advance," I shouted. We surged forward, but within 50 yards we hit the second line of defense. This time it was a network of rifle pits connected by trenches, each position mutually supporting the others. Japanese soldiers popped up like jack-in-the-boxes, fired a few rounds, then disappeared before we could return effective fire. Lieutenant Morrison took a round through the thigh and went down hard. As I crawled over to check on him, a sniper's bullet cracked past my ear. Somewhere up in the palm trees, a Japanese marksman was drawing a bead on anyone who looked like an officer. "Medic," I called, but I already knew our corpsman, Doc Peterson, was pinned down with the second platoon. Morrison grabbed my arm. "Captain, The left flank is wide open. If we can get a squad around behind that trench line. He was right. The Japanese had concentrated their fire to the front, leaving their left side vulnerable. But it would mean sending men across an open stretch of ground under direct observation. "O'Brien," I called, "take your squad and work around that palm grove. See if you can get behind their positions." What followed was 15 minutes of the most intense combat I ever witnessed. O'Brien led his men in a flanking movement while the rest of us maintained suppressing fire. Every few seconds, a Japanese soldier would pop up from a hidden position and spray automatic fire in our direction. We learned to recognize the sound of their weapons, the slower, more deliberate firing of their Arisaka rifles, the faster chatter of their light machine guns. Private Johnson, the nervous kid from Cedar Rapids, proved himself that morning. When our bar gunner went down with a head wound, Johnson grabbed the weapon and laid down covering fire that allowed 2 wounded men to crawl to safety. He fired with mechanical precision, switching targets as they appeared, conserving ammunition like a veteran. Then O'Brien's voice crackled over the radio. "We're in position, Captain. I can see their command bunker." "Light it up," I replied. The explosion that followed shook the ground under our feet. O'Brien had worked his way to within grenade range of what turned out to be Colonel Yamamoto's forward command post. When the smoke cleared, the entire left side of the Japanese defense line was in chaos. "All platoons in advance," I ordered. We swept over the rifle pits like a wave. Most of the Japanese defenders fought to the death, just as they'd been trained. I watched one wounded soldier, his left arm hanging useless at his side, continue firing his rifle one-handed until Private Davis put 2 rounds center mass. But it wasn't over. As we consolidated our position, mortar rounds began falling among us. The Japanese had a second line of defense further back, and they'd already registered our current position for indirect fire. "Incoming!" someone screamed. I threw myself behind a shattered palm trunk as the ground erupted in a series of explosions. Dirt and debris rained down on us, along with something wet that I tried not to think about. When the barrage lifted, I did a quick head count. We'd taken 18 casualties in the first hour of fighting, killed and wounded combined. That was 10% of my effective strength, and we'd only advanced about 200 yards. But the Japanese had lost more. I could see at least 30 bodies scattered across the positions we'd just captured, and more were undoubtedly buried in collapsed bunkers. Colonel Yokoyama's 144th Infantry Regiment was being bled white. The second assault began at 1400 hours. This time we had mortar support from our 81mm tubes, but the jungle canopy limited their effectiveness. Most of the rounds burst in the treetops, sending down a shower of branches and leaves, but doing little damage to the well-protected Japanese positions. I was studying the enemy line through binoculars when Lieutenant Chen, our new communications officer, crawled up beside me. "Captain, we've got Australian forces attacking Gona from the west." Heavy fighting reported. That was good news. If the Australians could take Gona, it would relieve pressure on our assault at Buna. But I also knew the Aussies were facing the same nightmare we were, well-prepared defensive positions held by desperate men. "What about air support?" I asked. "P-39's inbound in 20 minutes. They'll strafe the bunker line before we attack." The airstrike was both spectacular and disappointing. I watched our Cobra fighters dive out of the tropical sun, their 20mm cannons and machine guns raking the Japanese positions. Smoke and debris filled the air, and for a moment I allowed myself to hope that the Japanese defenses had been shattered. Then the return fire started up, and I realized the bunkers were still very much operational. "Second wave, prepared to advance," I called. This time we tried a different approach. Instead of frontal assault, we would advance in small teams, using cover and concealment to get close enough for grenade attacks. It was slower, but it reduced casualties. Private Williams led the first fire team forward, crawling through a drainage ditch that ran parallel to the Japanese line. I watched him inch forward, stopping every few feet to listen and observe. Behind him, 3 other soldiers followed in single file. They made it to within 30 yards of a large bunker before a Japanese sentry spotted them. The enemy soldier shouted a warning, but Williams was already in motion. He pulled the pin on a grenade and rolled it toward the bunker's firing slit in one smooth motion. The explosion was followed by screaming from inside the bunker. Williams and his team rushed forward, firing into the position at point-blank range. When the smoke cleared, another strongpoint had been eliminated, but the cost was growing. Williams took a rifle round through the leg during his assault. Private Kowalski, following behind him, stepped on a concealed mine and was killed instantly. For every bunker we eliminated, we paid in blood. By sunset on November 20th, we had advanced perhaps 400 yards. The Japanese still held their main defensive line, though we'd eliminated several outposts. More importantly, we'd learned something crucial about our enemy. They would not retreat. Every position had to be taken by direct assault. Every bunker had to be cleared by hand-to-hand combat. That night, as I wrote my after-action report by flashlight, I calculated our losses. Company B had suffered 37 casualties in one day, killed, wounded, and missing. We were down to barely 100 effective soldiers, but the Japanese had lost more. Intelligence estimates put their casualties at over 150 just in our sector. Colonel Yokoyama's defensive plan was working in that he was inflicting heavy casualties on us, but he was also being systematically destroyed in the process. The fighting continued for weeks. Every day brought new horrors and small victories. We learned to recognize the signs of Japanese defensive positions, the carefully camouflaged firing slits, the interconnected trenches, the snipers' nests in the palm trees. We developed tactics to deal with each threat, though every lesson cost us lives. Private Johnson, the nervous kid from Cedar Rapids, became one of our most effective soldiers. He had a natural ability to spot concealed positions and an uncanny sense for when the Japanese were about to attack. On December 2nd, he single-handedly held off a Japanese counterattack, while the rest of his squad evacuated 2 wounded men. But the jungle was killing us as surely as enemy bullets. By early December, nearly half my company was down with malaria, dysentery, or dengue fever. Men who could barely stand were still fighting because we had no replacements. Doc Peterson was treating tropical ulcers, fungal infections, and vitamin deficiency diseases alongside combat wounds. Captain, he told me one evening as we shared a can of cold rations, we're fighting on borrowed time. These boys need medical attention and rest. I knew he was right, but there was no rest to be had. Intelligence reports indicated the Japanese were in even worse shape than we were. Their supply situation had deteriorated to the point where they were eating grass and tree bark. Many were too weak from disease to man their weapons effectively. The breakthrough came on December 14th. Australian forces finally broke through the Japanese defenses at Gona, eliminating nearly 800 enemy troops in the process. With their left flank exposed, the Japanese began withdrawing from some of their forward positions at Buna. "Now's our chance," I told Lieutenant Morrison, who had returned to duty despite his leg wound. "They're pulling back. If we hit them while they're moving." We launched our attack at dawn. This time, instead of facing prepared positions, we caught Japanese soldiers in the open as they attempted to retreat to their final defensive line. It was a slaughter. I watched through binoculars as a column of perhaps 50 enemy soldiers tried to move from one bunker complex to another. They were strung out in single file, many of them clearly sick or wounded. Our machine gunners caught them in the open ground. It was over in minutes. When the firing stopped, bodies littered the jungle floor. A few wounded Japanese soldiers crawled toward cover, but most lay still in the morning sunlight. That day, we advanced over a mile, more than we'd gained in the previous 3 weeks combined. But the cost continued to mount. Sergeant O'Brien, who had led so many successful assaults, took a sniper's bullet through the neck while clearing a bunker complex. He died in my arms, trying to tell me something about his wife back in Chicago. By December 20th, the Japanese defensive perimeter had shrunk to a narrow strip along the coast. Colonel Yokoyama and his surviving troops were trapped with their backs to the sea. There would be no evacuation, no relief force, no miracle rescue. They were going toady in that pestilent jungle, just as so many of us had died trying to dig them out. The final assault began on January 2nd, 1943. We had been reinforced by elements of the 41st Infantry Division and several Australian units. For the first time since the campaign began, we had local superiority in numbers. I remember standing with Colonel Smith as we watched the preparatory bombardment. Every artillery piece we could bring to bear was hammering the remaining Japanese positions. Naval gunfire from destroyers offshore added to the symphony of destruction. The jungle ahead of us disappeared in a wall of smoke and flame. "This is it," Smith said quietly. "One more push and Buna falls." When the barrage lifted, we advanced across ground that had been torn apart by high explosives. Shell craters filled with stagnant water dotted the landscape. Trees had been reduced to splintered stumps. The very air seemed to burn with cordite and phosphorus smoke. But the Japanese were still there, still fighting. Wounded soldiers fired from shell holes until our advancing infantry overran them. A machine gun nest that should have been destroyed by the bombardment suddenly came to life, cutting down 3 men before Private Johnson silenced it with a rifle grenade. The final resistance came from a concrete blockhouse that had somehow survived everything Wade thrown at it. Inside, an unknown number of Japanese soldiers had barricaded themselves with the apparent intention of fighting to the end. "Flamethrower," I called. Private Rodriguez moved forward with the bulky weapon strapped to his back. I watched him advance methodically, ignoring the rifle fire coming from the blockhouse. When he was in range, he triggered the weapon. A stream of liquid fire arced through the air and poured into the blockhouse's firing slits. The screaming that followed was barely human. Then figures stumbled out of the structure, their uniforms ablaze, only to be cut down by our covering fire. When it was over, when the last shot had been fired and the last Japanese soldier lay dead, I found myself standing in the ruins of what had once been Buna Village. Around me, exhausted American and Australian soldiers sat or lay on the ground, too tired to celebrate. We had won, but the cost had been staggering. My company had started the campaign with 180 men. On January 3, 1943, I could muster fewer than 60 soldiers fit for duty. The rest were dead, wounded, or too sick to fight. But the Japanese losses were even more catastrophic. In the Buna-Gona campaign alone, they had lost over 13,000 troops killed or died of disease. Colonel Yokoyama's 144th Infantry Regiment had been completely destroyed. The South Seas Detachment had ceased to exist as a fighting force. More importantly, we had proven something crucial about the Japanese military. They were not invincible. They could be beaten by determined Allied forces using proper tactics and overwhelming firepower. The myth of Japanese military supremacy had died in the jungles of Papua New Guinea. As I write this, more than 50 years later, I can still smell that jungle, the rotting vegetation, the cordite, the death. I can still hear the sound of Japanese machine guns and screams of wounded men calling for medics who couldn't reach them. But I also remember the courage of ordinary American boys who found themselves in extraordinary circumstances. Private Johnson, the nervous kid from Cedar Rapids, earned a Silver Star for his actions during the campaign. Sergeant O'Brien was posthumously awarded the Distinguished Service Cross. Doc Peterson, our company medic, received the Navy Cross for repeatedly exposing himself to enemy fire while treating wounded soldiers. The Battle of Buna-Gona was just one campaign in a war that would continue for 2 more years. But it was the campaign where we learned that the Japanese could be beaten, that their supposedly impregnable fortifications could be overcome by infantry willing to pay the price in blood. They starved, bled, and burned, and we never stopped advancing. That was the lesson of New Guinea, written in the lives of too many good men who never made it home to tell their own stories. The green hell had consumed us all, victors and vanquished alike. But in the end, the American flag flew over Buna-Gona, and the Japanese Empire had taken another step toward its ultimate defeat. That had to count for something. That had to make the price we paid worth paying. As I folded up my final report and prepared to evacuate the surviving members of Company B, I took one last look at the jungle that had been our home and our hell for nearly 3 months. Somewhere in that green tangle lay the bones of Colonel Yokoyama and his men, along with too many of our own. But we were going home, and they were not. That, in the end, was the only victory that mattered.